Yeah. Good morning. I said, good morning. All right, that's much more like it. Okay, so how many of you have read the book Unbroken? How many of you have seen the film Unbroken? Okay, so some of you have no idea what I'll be talking about. Okay, so I'll try to be clear. How many of you believe in miracles? Good, because this is a life full of miracles. And we're going to look at some of those miracles today. Good. I moved too far forward. Am I feeding back? Okay. So I'm going to take you back to the year 1934. It was a long time ago. It was the Great Depression. It was before World War II. In 1934, actually 1933, Hitler was getting in power in Germany. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was elected president of the United States. And in Torrance, well, this is my picture of my father when he was about 13 or 14 years old. In Torrance, California, that was the face of public enemy number one. He was a son of Italian immigrants. He barely spoke English himself. And he was, the first chapter of the book is titled A One Boy Insurgency. And he had a crime syndicate in Torrance. If there was a pie shop called Miner's Pie Shop, and he routinely robbed them of pies, and he robbed the pie delivery truck. And as a matter of fact, if someone was preparing their dinner, if they didn't watch out, he'd come by their house and steal all the food. Now, he started smoking at age 5. And when he turned 7, he started drinking. And he would take a milk bottle and he painted the inside of it white so it would look like it was full of milk. And he'd fill it full of beer or wine and go down to the beach with him and his buddies and they'd drink. And he was constantly in fights. The other kids would pick on him just because they wanted to hear him swear in Italian. He was... the cops couldn't catch him because he was fast on his feet. So finally, one day, his older brother, my Uncle Pete, got together with the chief of police and said, "What are we going to do about Louis?" And he said, "So maybe we could get him into athletics." And so the chief of police said, "Well, let me suggest track and field because we've been chasing him all over town and can't catch him." And so they did. My uncle started training him, and he resisted the training. My dad was a very defiant person, by the way. Maybe not see it in that photograph, but he was very defiant. And so he ended up going up to an Indian reservation outside Los Angeles, up in the mountains, about a mile high. And he stayed in the cabin, and he got up and he ran all day long, every day at a mile altitude. And at the end of the summer, he came down from that experience and he determined that he was going to run. And he started running and he never lost a race. And then this is him when he broke the high school record for the mile at 4 minutes and 28 seconds. This was decades before the 4-minute mile had been achieved. And you can see still the defiant look on his face. His defiance would be what got him through a lot of the stuff that I'm going to tell you about. So he set the record. That record held for 19 years, high school record for the mile. Tim, he's qualifying for the 1936 Olympics. The man he's racing against is from Indiana University, and he's got his Torrance High School shirt on. He wasn't even in college yet, and he was able to make his trip to the Olympics in Berlin in 1936. This was the Olympics of Adolf Hitler and a guy named Jesse Owens. You ever heard of Jesse Owens? Okay, great athlete. He was a black man who basically destroyed the Aryan myth that the Nazis were promoting by winning the decathlon. He was a great athlete. As a matter of fact, my dad was his roommate in the Olympic Village. And they told Jesse Owens, look after this crazy kid from California, make sure he doesn't get in trouble. And so, here's Louis in his Olympic outfit. So in those days, to get from America to Europe, you had to take a ship. And so he got on a cruise ship with the whole Olympic team. And of course, being a skinny kid from California, he never saw so much food in his life. So he ate and ate and ate. I mean, anybody heard of a book called Boys in the Boat? Okay, my dad is mentioned in there as the one who ate the most on that ship. So by the time he got to Germany and was competing, he'd gained 14 pounds. And my uncle was furious with him. He said, well, Louis, you just ate yourself out of a medal. Now in Germany, he was still, here's a picture of the Olympic Stadium. I don't know if you can see it too well, but you see all the arms outstretched. My dad took this picture from his seat in the stadium, and that's all of them doing their Heil Hitler salute. New country, new cops. And so, of course, Louis, after he ran his heat, he was in the 5,000 meter run. And because he gained so much weight, he didn't medal. But there was like a group of runners in the front, about 6 guys, most of them from Finland. They had outrun the rest of the group. My dad was in the second group behind them. And on the last lap, he sprinted. And this is what my dad's running style was all about. It was the last quarter mile of the race that he would run, he would sprint as fast as he could. So here he is. He leaves the second pack. He's wandering around, catches the group in front just before they cross the finish line. Of course, it was very dramatic. If you were in the stadium, you could see this person trying to win the race from behind. He ran the last lap in 56 seconds, which is, that's on pace to break the 4-minute mile. And of course, this drew the attention of Adolf Hitler, and he was taken from the stands and brought up to the box where Der Fuhrer was watching the Olympics, and he met him. I said, well, what was that like, Dad? He goes, well, he just reached down from his seat and shook my hand. I go, well, what was that like? He said, it was a flaccid handshake. It was just, he was not a very dynamic person to meet. So now that he's done with his race, he decides he's wants to sample the automats that they had in the Olympic Village. It was all very modern. Automats were a big thing in the 1930s, where you'd come and you'd put your money in a machine and a sandwich would come out, or something to drink. And he found that the automat in the Olympic Village would dispense beer. So he thought he'd try every single beer that he could. And pretty soon, these were 1 liter portions. So he found himself wandering through Berlin, and he sees this big building. And it's got all these Nazi flags hanging on it. And sees a car pull up, and it's Hitler. He's going into his office building, and the Reich Chancellery building. And so he's looking at these swastikas, and he's thinking, now that's a souvenir I want. So he sees that there's 2 guards walking back and forth, protecting the front of the building. And so he times him and thinks, okay, when they cross, I can start running towards the building. And he did. He ran down there, got up the side of the building, grabbed hold of one of the swastikas, pulled it off, dropped to the ground, and started running. And here's all this, halten Sie, halten Sie. And finally, he hears a gunshot. They shot a bullet over his head, so he finally stopped. And these guards came up and they grabbed him. They turned him around, and they were going to probably beat the tar out of him. And they saw the Olympic symbols on his jacket, and they said, "Well, who are you?" And actually, they went and got an officer who spoke English, and he identified himself. And they said, "Why'd you take the flag?" Because they thought he was protesting. And actually, they were afraid he was one of the Jewish American Olympians that were there that actually were not allowed to compete once they got there. And so he just said, well, I just wanted to get a souvenir from the wonderful time I had in this most glorious country. And so they said, well, stay here. And they went inside and came back out later on with the flag all folded up and said, you may keep the flag. And so the flag, we still have possession of the flag. It's in a museum in Torrance, California, which has all of my dad's paraphernalia. So there it is. That was him. It was in Berlin, him getting a picture of himself with the flag he stole. And then he came back to the States, and this was a track meet in 1938, where this was West Coast teams versus East Coast teams. And the night before this race, one of the East Coast coaches came to him and said, I hate to tell you this, Zamp, but they've determined that the West Coast will not have a champion, so you're going to be boxed in tomorrow. And he didn't think much of it, but when he got into the race, he was boxed in. This was a mile race, and so he gets on the inside of the track, and all the runners are getting around him, and they're cleating him. They're kicking him with the cleats on their shoes. Now, unlike today's Nike running shoes, these old shoes had, half-inch to three-quarter-inch long iron spikes coming out of the bottom of them. That's how you got traction on those dirt tracks. And so he got his foot stepped on, he got kicked, he got elbowed. And so for 3/4 of a mile, he could not break out of this pack while, one of the East Coast runners was out in front. So finally he saw his chance, and that just defiant nature of his just kicked in. He was able to break out of that pack, and he just ran as fast as he could. He passed the leader and crossed the finish line in first place. And his coach came up to him afterward and said, well, Louis, how fast do you think you ran? He goes, I probably couldn't do more than 4 minutes and 25 seconds because I was boxed in the whole time. He said, Louis, you just set the college record for the mile at 4 minutes, 8 seconds. And this is him afterwards. And you could see all the bandages on his legs where he had been cleated by the other runners. And but he won. And so he was destined to be, or at least he thought he was destined to be, the first man to break the 4-minute mile. Because it had 8 seconds to go, and he was training hard, better and better and better. But then he didn't quite get there, and he started to lose races at this point, and no one can figure out why. So in 1940, before he graduated from college at the University of Southern California, he joined the military because everyone knew that war was coming in 1940. It was only a matter of time. War was already raging in Europe. And so he wanted to be a pilot. So he joined the Army Air Corps. And he washed out as a pilot, but they made him a bombardier and assigned him to a B-24 squadron in Hawaii. And so he went on a few raids there. This was his plane. This was called Superman. Nose art. This was clean nose art. I don't know if any of you study World War II at all, but some of the nose art from these airplanes can be quite provocative. So they were in Superman, and that's his buddy. That's his pilot buddy up there, Phil. You'll hear more about Phil in a minute. And so one of the raids he went on was to bomb an island called Nauru, and it was an island that produced a lot of minerals and things that the Japanese needed to make their armaments. And so this raid, they come in with the B-24. He was a lead bomber, and he was able to hit the end of the runway. He had a little shack that he dropped the bomb on, and it was actually the fuel depot, and it just blew up. And so once they made the bombing run and they took off, they could see all these Japanese fighter planes taking off. They were called Zeros. And so 4 Zeros headed for the lead plane. It was my dad's plane. And they shot him up pretty good. The hydraulic system was blown out. Half the tail was shot off. They had 8 hours flight time to get back to their base, flying over the ocean, and didn't know if they were going to make it. Most of the crew was shot up. My dad, after he would drop the bombs, his job was to go and assist everybody else that was manning machine guns, trying to fight off the Zeros. And of course, the turret gunner had his foot blown off by a cannon shot that went right past my dad's head and took his foot off. As my dad was administering first aid to the radio man who'd been hit with shrapnel. So 8 hours later, they finally were able to crash land on an island called Funafuti. And they knew they had no hydraulics, so they had no brakes, and it was a short runway. So he thought he would improvise. So he got all the parachutes and tied them to the waist gunner windows. And the B-24 was an open aircraft. So you stood there with your machine gun shooting out an open window. And so he hooked the parachutes up to it. And with the idea that when they hit the runway, he released the parachutes. And this has never been done before. But unbeknownst to him, the left tire of the plane's landing gear had been blown out by a cannon shot. So as soon as they landed, just the suspension that held that tire just dug into the runway, and they just spinned around and stopped. And this is a picture of him looking through one of the shrapnel holes. They had 600 holes in that airplane from shrapnel, from machine gun fire, and cannon fire. It was just a miracle that they got back. And then they had to get a new crew, and they had to get a new plane. And so they gave them this plane, the Green Hornet, which was a notorious plane for being mechanically unsound. And they were given a task to go out and search for a B-25 crew that had crashed about 200 miles from an island called Palmyra. And so they're out there flying along. And they decide they get to the area where they're supposed to search, and there's cloud cover, so they get down below the cloud cover, which means they're about 800 feet above the water, looking for men in the water. And suddenly, the number one engine on this plane conks out. So there's 4 engines on a B-24. This is the one on the far left. That one conks out. And there is a process you do when the engine shuts off. You're supposed to do what it's called feathering the engine, where you turn the propeller so they stop resisting the air. And so the pilot asked the engineer to feather number 1 engine. And he hit the wrong button and shut off engine number 2. So now you only had 2 engines running on the right side of the airplane, and it just cartwheeled over and crashed into the ocean. And this was my dad. His position for the crash was to get a uninflated life raft and get at the waist gunner window. And so when the crash would happen, he'd get out the window and inflate the raft. So what happened when the plane hit the water is that he was shoved under the machine gun mount, which was a tripod on the side of the airplane, and he was stuck under it. And then when the tail of the airplane snapped off, all the cables that controlled the tail from the flight deck, they snapped off and they wrapped around him in that tripod. Now he was stuck. He couldn't free himself. And the plane is sinking. And he's struggling and he's struggling and he's struggling. He can't get free. And the plane's going, the water's coming up, coming up, coming up. And finally, he takes his last breath and he thinks, this is it. I'm dead. He's still struggling. He can't get free. Now, he told me he could hold his breath underwater for about 3 minutes. And so he held his breath and he kept struggling. And finally, it got dark and he blacked out. He said it felt like a sledgehammer hit him in the head. And he thought, this is it. I'm dead. And next thing he knows, he's got a floating sensation. And he figures, wow, this is the afterlife. And so he's, what he had a class ring on his left hand, and the class ring caught onto a part of the airplane, and actually the force of the plane sinking and the buoyancy of his body from still having air in his lungs caused the ring to cut down to the bone of his finger, and that woke him up. And then he realized where he was, and he felt around because it's pitch black. He felt around, and he felt the waist gunner window, and he pulled himself out, shot to the surface where there was just debris everywhere, oil in the water. He's throwing up, and he's sees that the pilot and the tail gunner are hanging onto a piece of the airplane that broke off, and there's this blood shooting out of the pilot's head. And he looks and he sees there's a couple of rafts. So these airplanes, when they crashed, they also had rafts that would jettison and then fill up when they hit the water. So he sees the raft going by, and he's thinking, I gotta save Phil, but I've got to get that raft, and it's so far away. And then suddenly he realizes, he sees the line. It was like 100-foot rope attached to the raft. The last 3 feet of it was going by, and he just grabbed it and is able to pull himself over to the raft and get in, and then go over and get Phil. And there was one more guy, the tail gunner, Mac. And he pulled them into the raft, and then he went and got the second raft, and they lashed them together. So he's sitting there thinking, he goes, I can't imagine how I got free. He was entangled. He was stuck in that airplane, unable to free himself. And suddenly he found himself floating to the surface. It had to have been a miracle. And so he believes that he had a guardian angel. He told me that whenever he'd pray, he named the guardian angel Victor for victory. So whenever he would pray, he said he'd put a good word in for Victor, for saving him from that. And so now this began an odyssey at sea. They floated 47 days in those life rafts, and they drifted from the near Hawaii. They drifted 2,000 miles into the Western Pacific that was controlled by the Empire of Japan. Now, the life rafts were not well provisioned in 1943 when they crashed. There was no knife. There was a repair kit, but it had no sandpaper for repairing the rubber raft. There was some fishing gear. There was 6 pints of water and 6 chocolate bars. And, as soon as they got settled in the raft, the tail gunner starts to panic. He says, we're all going to die. We're all going to die. And so my dad was determined to survive. That first night, Mac, the tail gunner, ate all the chocolate bars while they were sleeping. There was enough provisions for the 3 of them for at least a week, all gone the first night. And they just continued to float. And after about 3 days, you see an airplane going by, and their shooting flares off, and the airplane doesn't see them. They went from elation, thinking we're going to be rescued, to being depressed, knowing that they're going to keep floating in the ocean. And so after about 27 days, they saw another airplane. By the way, they had no food. I mean, there's just the chocolate bars. That was it. He tried. They tried doing some fishing, but they had no bait. So what he did is he tied some fish hooks on his fingers, and the raft being surrounded by sharks all the time, the shark would go by, and the sharks have what they call pilot fish that swim along with them. So he'd try to grab a pilot fish with the hooks on his fingers, and he'd get 1 or 2 of them, but they were small like this. It wasn't much food for them, and it was raw. So after a few days, an albatross lands on my dad's head while they're laying in the raft. This is the equatorial Pacific. It's hot. And so the albatross lands on his head, and he grabs it, and he kills it. And now we have some bait. So we'll cut up the albatross. And though they didn't have a knife, they had a little brass mirror about like this. It was used to reflect light, on passing airplanes to try to get their attention. So they There was a pair of pliers that they used to then serrate the edge of that thing, and they were able to cut the bird meat up. And of course, they put it on the hooks and put it in the water, and the sharks got it. And so the sharks would just eat the bait and destroy the fishing line, and still no food. And then a few weeks later, another albatross landed on the ship, on the raft, and my dad grabbed it and killed it. And this time they tried to eat the raw bird, and they couldn't do it. They tried to eat, they couldn't hold it down, they threw up. It was just a terrible waste. And he told me that a third time towards the end of their journey, they had caught one more albatross, and this had been 35 days of no food. And he said, well, we ate that one. And he said, man, it was like a hot fudge sundae. It was, where they couldn't eat it before, now they were so starved, they loved eating it. So they're followed by sharks all the time. And so finally they figured that, well, the sharks keep trying to eat us, and maybe we want to eat a shark instead. So he waited till one came by, and he waited till it was maybe a 5-footer. There were some big sharks there. And so he grabbed this shark by the tail, thinking to pull it out of the water. It just pulled him in the water instead. And so he scrambled back in and thought, well, we'll try it again with a smaller shark. So now a 4-footer goes by a day or two later, and he grabs it and he pulls it into the raft. And once you get the shark's tail out of the water, they lose all their power. That's the tail is how they propel themselves. And so they get it in the raft, and the pair of pliers had a little, like a screwdriver as part of the handle. They used that to get the shark through the eye into its brain and kill it. And then they would use that brass mirror to saw through the skin. Take about a half hour to get to that shark skin, to the one thing that they could eat, that they were told they could eat, which was the shark's liver. It was about that big. It was like a big pork loin. And so the three of them ate that, and that was some good nourishment. So around day 27, they hear an airplane. And so they see it in the sky, and they throw dye in the water. They're shooting flares up, and they get that brass mirror, and they're reflecting it onto the side of the airplane. Well, they finally got their attention. And here comes the plane, and they're elated that they're going to be rescued. And the plane comes down lower and lower and lower, and suddenly the ocean is erupting around them. This was a Japanese patrol bomber, and it decided to use these two little rafts tied together as target practice. And so here's, this bullets coming at them, this bullets going through the raft, this bullets in the water. My dad instinctively jumps over the side. Why? Well, as an Eagle Scout, he had learned that bullets will lose their velocity in about 3 or 4 feet of water. And so I thought, if I can get under the raft and hang onto that line, I can avoid the bullets. So he's down there, he's hanging onto that line. He's looking up, and you can see the bullets going through the raft. His 2 raft mates are still up there. And he sees the bullets coming through, and you can see all the bubbles coming off the bullets as they slow down. And thinks this is great. And then he notices that there's an 8-foot tiger shark coming his way. And so, I got to tell you that his education saved his life, because, he, being a scout, he learned first aid to save his pilot buddy who had an injury to the head. He learned the thing about the bullets in water. He also took a course in Hawaii about surviving at sea with sharks around. It was an old Hawaiian man teaching this course. And they said, well, look, sharks don't like to see white. So, first thing you do is you open your eyes real wide and show them your teeth. And he said, so I tried that, and it didn't work. So the next thing he did was that, now here comes the shark. Okay. Shark is coming up, and it turns its body so that its mouth would be lined up with your body. And so it's coming at him, and he's hanging on to this line. And he goes, so I straight armed the shark. I go, what did you mean, Dad? You punch the shark in the nose? I go, no, you can't do that. Because if you miss the nose and your hand goes in his mouth, you're done. So like a running back, he just reached out and just pushed off on the shark's nose. Turns out that sharks have sensitive noses, and when they get bumped, they freak out. And so the shark takes off and does a big, wide turn. He sees the bullets have stopped. He goes back up to get some air now, and here comes the plane back for another run. So he goes back down there, and here comes the shark again. When the strafing was done, climbed back in the raft. He's absolutely certain that his raft mates were dead. When he eventually counted the holes in the raft. One raft is completely obliterated. The other raft had 48 bullet holes in it. And so he climbs back into the raft, and immediately they try to start to repair the raft. So the pilot grabs it. They had a little pump, and the pilot grabs the pump, and he's pumping. And my dad's grabbing the edge of the deflated raft. Now this deflated now. They may be that far out of the water, and so he's pulling the bottom of the raft up to see if he can fix the holes in the bottom first. And right when he's doing that, here comes the shark right for his head. And it was at that point that the tail gunner, who had been lethargic the entire time, picked an aluminum ore that they had and started whacking the shark in the head. And so this went on. They had to repair the raft. The sharks kept coming. And so Phil would pump, Louis would do the repairs, and Mac would fend off the sharks. Now, they had to take turns doing this because Phil would run out of energy after about 10 minutes. 10 minutes on, 20 minutes off as the pumping duty went between the three of them. So incidentally, 48 holes in the raft and not a scratch on Phil or Mac, not a scratch. And there was bullet holes an eighth of an inch from their legs. Not a scratch. That had to have been a miracle. And of course, Phil said, well, if they had bad with their machine guns, we're going to win this war. So went on for 72 hours, and them being on and off the pump to keep the thing afloat until they finally got the holes repaired. And then they only had to pump it up several times a day. And so they were wearing themselves out. So they were able to catch one more shark. And then on day 34, Mac passed away. He was the one who was not in shape. He was the one who was a pessimist about their condition. He was certain they were going to die, and he died. And so they let him over the side. Now there was just the two of them. And so, there was one point where they were out of water. Now, any of you studying medicine or science? Okay, well, a doctor will tell you that after 5 days with no water, you're dying. You're going to die. There was 7 days without any water. Went on, and they knew they were dying. My dad knew they were dying, and so he was not a religious guy at all. But he thought, well, what else can you do? So he prayed to God. He said, Lord, if you save me from this, if you get me home from this, I will seek you and serve you my entire life. And he finishes praying, and they look on the horizon. There's this black cloud, and so they start paddling like mad towards the cloud, and the cloud's coming towards them, and it's rain. And so they're able to lean their heads back and drink the rainwater as much as they could. He took a flap that was where all the pocket in the raft where they had all their supplies. He ripped the top off of it and used it as a funnel to try to funnel water into these 6 empty cans that they had. Then they would get water in their mouth, and they would spit into the cans to try to save it for later. So that was a miracle. And there were 2 more times when they were completely out of water. 2 more times he prayed. 2 more times the rains came, and that was miraculous. Now, day 46, they get into a typhoon. And now the seas, have you ever been in rough seas? I boat, And if you got 6-foot waves, I'm scared. These were 40-foot waves, 40 feet from the bottom to the top. They were in total fear. This is the most scared he was. Total fear that they would be crushed by the breaking waves. They would flip the raft over and they would drown. So up the wave. Then they think it's going to flip them over from the top, down the wave. But the next day, on the 47th day, the sea was still somewhat tumultuous. Up on top of one of those waves, they saw an island. And, 7 weeks at sea, an island is it's like, okay. And so they start paddling towards that island. And they get almost close enough when they see a Japanese patrol boat come around and them up. And the Japanese aid them when they got them on the ship. And my dad, who, as a world-class athlete, was 5'10", 155 pounds, and except for when he ate too much at the Olympics. So they weighed him, and they weighed him at just over 30 kilos, which is like 66 to 70 pounds. They lost 2/3 of his body. These guys were emaciated. The only thing that kept him going on the life raft was, my dad knew that the mind was like a muscle. If you didn't exercise it, it would atrophy. So he would make up these imaginary meals on the raft to exercise his mind and to entice the palates of his raft mates. And so he ended up doing breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And these guys would be saying, "Well, so how much salt did you put in that chicken cacciatore? Or how much butter and this or that?" Said after a while, they got really selfish and they wanted brunch too. So the Japanese, they took him to an island called Kwajalein, and it was known as Execution Island. American flyers were considered war criminals by the Japanese because right after Pearl Harbor, where they attacked our fleet in Hawaii, we had some bombers on an aircraft carrier that got close enough to bomb Tokyo. So the Japanese government said, well, all American flyers are war criminals, and therefore you execute them when you find them. So they took them to Execution Island, and before they killed them, they would interrogate them. So my dad goes into this room, and there's these 6 Japanese naval officers, all dressed in white with gold braids on their shoulders, and a table of goodies in front of them. So it's like if you answer correctly, you might get a goodie. And of course, they'd been at sea so long they had no war news to share with them, and said that. But one of these Japanese officers says, "Lieutenant Zamperini, I'm a Trojan." And I said, "What?" My dad went to the University of Southern California, and they're called the Trojans, right? And so here's this Japanese officer who had gone to USC. He goes, "Yes, when you were just entering USC, I was graduating." And he couldn't believe it. He said, there are the 6 officers. This was the biggest stinker of them all. And he was saying he's from USC. And, he said afterwards he thought about it, and he thought this guy, had to have been a third-year transfer from UCLA, which was a competing college in Los Angeles. So this guy realized that my dad had propaganda potential. Said, we don't want to kill this guy. We want to ship him to Tokyo for propaganda purposes. And so off he went. And the first prison camp they put him in was a prison camp that was not registered with the International Red Cross. It's where they kept high-profile prisoners, and they were not allowed to speak. He spent a year there in solitary confinement. And so you think about when he spent 47 days in a raft that was like 2 foot by 6 foot with this expanse of water over it. And then when they put him in solitary confinement, it's a space dug out of the coral that's 3 foot by 6 feet by 7 foot. So he could stand up and he could lay down, and that was about it. What that does to you mentally is just astonishing. So they they keep him in this hidden prison camp for a year and a month. And why? Because they were waiting for the United States War Department to declare him dead. A year and a month for a missing in action is then declared dead. And so once that happened, they were able to bring him out and try to use him for propaganda purposes. Now, he was a defiant guy and he wouldn't agree to go along with it. And they assigned a particular guard to him, this man. His name was Mutsuhiro Watanabe. The prisoners they had nicknames for all their guards. And this guy was a real brutal man. But he spoke English, so they couldn't call him what they wanted to call him. They called him the Bird because of his bird-like gaze. And it was his job to break my dad so he would do propaganda broadcasts for Radio Tokyo. And so this was the most frightening person he ever met in his life. This man beat my dad with a kendo stick the first time he laid eyes on him, and he beat him every single day for 27 months. And with his fist, with his feet, with his kendo stick, he had a belt with a big iron buckle on it. He would take that off and whack him across the head. The Bird was a sadistic psychopath. And even the other Japanese Japanese prison guards were afraid of this man. Here is the official document from the War Department declaring my father dead. And so once that was released, they came to them and said, look, we'd like you to do a broadcast. We will let you write your own script so your parents will know you're alive. This is a copy of it you see the red stamp is the approval of the Japanese authorities letting him recite this speech on the radio. So of course they hear back home that he's alive, and the Japanese are trying to make it seem like, your government forgot all about you, but we're taking care of you. You're being taken care of by Imperial Japan. And then afterwards, they came up to him and said, oh, you have good broadcast voice. We'd like you to do more broadcasts, only this time Japanese hands will write the message. And they showed him one, and it was all propaganda. He said, no, I can't do this. And they tried to bribe him by saying, well, we're going to keep you in a Western-style hotel. You'll be eating Western-style food, and you'll be away from the Bird. And he thought, no, I can't do that. And so he refused, and they sent him back to the camp. And the Bird continued to try to break him. And then, the Japanese were beginning to lose the war. This is getting on now, 1945. They began to lose the war, and they know that the Allies are coming. And so the Japanese government issued what they call, it's called a kill-all order. So when the first Allied forces land on Japanese home islands, then they're going to take all the prison guards and put them to death because they didn't want to have these prisoners breaking out of the prison camps and causing trouble while they're trying to defend their islands. And that was scheduled for August 25th, 1945. But something happened. The Americans dropped a bomb on Hiroshima, and they followed up another bomb on Nagasaki a few days later. And today you're taught that this was a horrendous thing that we did and that we should be ashamed of ourselves. But at the time, it seemed like the right thing to do. It was estimated that there would be 1 million American casualties, or over 1 million American casualties in invading Japan, and untold millions of dead Japanese, because the Japanese would fight to the last man, woman, and child on their home islands. It's an existential threat to them. And so there were tens of thousands of people killed from these blasts, and it caused the Japanese to capitulate. Now, without the atomic bomb, my father would have been killed in the prison camp. I wouldn't be here today to talk to you. So it was actually a necessary thing to do. And when my dad had gone back to Japan later on, he'd met people who survived the blast in Hiroshima and Nagasaki that were proud to have been injured to to save so many other lives. So the war's over, and there's Louis right there, and you can see all these other prisoners. They were mostly from the British Empire, Australians, New Zealand, people captured in Singapore. Like I said, when they caught Americans, they usually just killed them. So this is them being repatriated. He finally made his way back home to, and of course his story preceded him coming back. He met a reporter in Manila on the way home that he told his story to, and it hit the papers. And now he's coming back, a famous American athlete coming back seemingly from the dead. And it's just, there he is with my two aunts standing to the side and my grandmother hugging my dad. And there's an extra set of hands there. You can't see him, but that's my grandfather behind them. This was the greatest day that he was looking forward to. And this is where the first film, Unbroken, ends. That one didn't tell the whole story. And there was a sequel that I'll tell you about in a minute. So now it's life in the fast lane for Louis. He's a famous hero come home from the war. The studios in Hollywood just say, you can come to all of our film sets, you come to all of our parties. He continued to do war bond sales on a tour of the United States because they were still having to pay for the war. And here's a picture of him with, you know who Maureen O'Hara was? She was a great actress in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. She did a lot of films with John Wayne. And I'll tell you, she never looked at John Wayne like that because this is a real hero, not a movie hero. But he brought something home with him from his ordeal. Today, you know what it is. It's called post-traumatic stress disorder. But back in the day, they didn't know what it was. And so he would have these nightmares. Like the very moment he met the bird and was beaten by him, his defiant nature, of course, wanted revenge. And so he wanted to strike back at the man, but he knew if he did, that they would just kill him or he'd just be beaten even worse. So he internalized his need for revenge, and it manifested itself in nightmares. And he pretty much had the same recurring nightmare where he was being beaten by the bird, and he'd get his hands around the bird's neck and he'd be choking the life out of him. And then he would wake up in a cold sweat. So that started in the prison camp, and he brought that home with him. And so even though he married, that's my mom, by the way, he married the girl of his dreams, and that's my grandparents behind them. Even though his life seemed to be going really well with all this notoriety and he's got married, he still was having these nightmares. And then he began to self-medicate with alcohol. And so like for 5 years after the war, he was a mess, and he kept getting in worse and worse shape. He was very resourceful and he could fix anything, but he couldn't fix his post-traumatic stress disorder. My mom said, after a while, she said, I can't take this any longer. I'm going to divorce you. My sister had just been born. And she said, the family's falling apart. I'm going to file for divorce and move back to my parents' home in Miami. And so he was just really at the bottom of this rope. And then something happened. My mom was invited by her neighbors to go to, actually they were both invited to go to see a new preacher in a tent meeting, a revival meeting in downtown Los Angeles. And it was a guy named Billy Graham. And this is a picture of that tent meeting in 1949. And so my dad refused to go. My mom went. And she came home that night and said, well, Louis, I'm not going to divorce you because of the newfound joy I have in my heart. I'm going to stick it out with you. And he thought, well, this is great. He says, but you got to go back and hear this guy with me. And he goes, well, I don't want to go to a revival tent meeting. And she said, well, she convinced him to go. So he went. And he said, well, here's the condition. That when this guy is telling me that I'm a sinner and I don't need to hear that. So when I get offended, we're leaving. She said, that's fine. So sure enough, to get to that point in the sermon, And he grabs her and leaves and goes home and says, never take me to a place like that again. I will not go back. And she said, well, Louis, because of the new relationship I have with Jesus in my heart, I'm going to remind you that I'm not going to divorce you. So she talks him into going back. And he said, well, the same condition applies. When I get offended, we are leaving. And so they go in, and sure enough, it gets to that point, and he grabs her, and he's heading out. Get to the aisle to go out to the back of the tent. And then he hears Reverend Graham say something to the effect of, when you get to the end of your rope and you have no place else to turn, that's when people look to God to save them from whatever situation you're in. And it suddenly reminded him of that prayer on the life raft when they had no water for 7 days. And he thought, my goodness, he said, God took care of his part of the bargain. I'm home. But Louis Zamperini did not. And he says, I don't know how it happened. I just found myself down in front of the stage where they had counselors to help you through the process. And he said, when I got off my knees after saying the sinner's prayer, he said, I knew I was done drinking. I knew I was done fighting. And I knew I'd forgiven my captors, including the bird. He'd forgiven him in his heart. And he went home that night. It was the first night in nearly 5 years that he didn't have that nightmare. And he never had it again the rest of his life. His PTSD was cured in an instant through the gospel. Now, does that happen to every soldier who comes to faith after their ordeal? No, but it happened to my dad. It was a miracle to demonstrate the power of God in someone's life. So it's not a miracle my dad called upon himself. God performed this miracle in his life so that his story would resonate with other people. Now, you may ask, how could he forgive the bird after everything he did to him? Well, it was tough. But in the end, he had to love that man with the same love that God had for him when he sent Jesus to the cross to die for our sins. And so he went home and suddenly, he picked up his service, New Testament, and finally it was starting to make sense to him. He turned his life around and became good friends with Billy Graham. There's the two of them in 1949. And by the way, this was the crusade that made Billy Graham famous. My dad was a famous man who came to faith. There were two other famous people that came to faith in that meeting. There was a guy named William Randolph Hearst who owned most of the newspapers in the country. For some reason, he decided to tell all of his editors, he said, puff Graham, which means give him good headlines and give him lots of headlines. This Los Angeles crusade went from 2 weeks to 8 weeks. And then from there on, Billy was just this tremendously well-known evangelist. And they stayed friends their entire lives. And so now, Dad is, his life has changed from trying to make a living to all of a sudden he's giving his testimony in churches all across the country. They're giving him honorarium. So he's making a living telling his story. And people were coming up to saying, yes, Louis, want to give you some money for your mission to Japan. He goes, I'm not going to Japan. So they kept giving him money. Finally, some guy from Texas sold his Cadillac and sent Dad the $500 he got for it and said, this is for your mission to Japan. So he finally said, okay, I'm going. And the General Doug MacArthur, who was the military governor of Japan after the war, had called for 2,500 missionaries and a million Bibles. And so he showed up and he wanted to go find his former prison guards and preach to them. Now, after the war, these prison guards were considered war criminals, so they were all locked up in a place called Sugamo Prison. And so he, flying across the Pacific to get there, he was thinking, okay, I know I've forgiven these guys in my heart, but what about when I looked them face to face? How am I going to react? He was still a little unsure about himself. And so he gets there and they won't let him in the prison. He said, sorry, there's no visitors. So he went to MacArthur's office and said, hey, you asked for all these missionaries and Bibles. Well, here I am. Let me in. So he finally got in to talk to his former prison guards. And he's standing there and he's recognizing them. But he's looking. He says, where's the bird? And, the bird wasn't around. They said, well, we think the bird committed suicide after the war because no one had heard from him. And so, sorry. And so he goes down in the audience and he's saying hello to all these former prison guards. And he told them his story. He told them about coming to faith. He told them that he forgave them. And then he went down, looked him in the eye and shook them all in the hands. So when he came back before I get to the next part of the story, I just want to ask you, how many of you have someone that you need to forgive? Someone that's harmed you, someone that's just treated you poorly. I'm telling you, forgiveness is a choice. You may not think that you're choosing to not forgive somebody, but just the fact that you don't forgive them is a choice that you've made. And you can't really heal and move on in life until you've forgiven them. Now, my dad would say that, harboring hatred for someone in your life does nothing to hurt them, but it's destroying you. It's like drinking poison and hoping the next guy dies. And it's just terrible. So it was actually, for him to forgive the bird was actually self-preservation for him. Because when you go through life hating somebody, you physiologically, you're prone to illness. Your immune system is down. You're pessimistic. You've got a poor attitude. But when you forgive somebody and then you start doing good deeds, then you get endorphins into your bloodstream and it helps your immune system and you become healthier and more vibrant. And so I would encourage you that for those of you that have someone that has harmed you, that you are harboring hatred for, you need to find a way to forgive them. Okay? So how do you do that? Now, forgiving is not the same as condoning. He never condoned the bird's behavior, but he forgave him because he tried to put himself in his shoes, tried to understand why the guy did what he did. And turns out later in life, we found out that the bird did not kill himself and that he had a successful life selling insurance after the war. And finally, at one point, CBS News caught up with the guy and interviewed him. And he just said, I was part of the Japanese Bushido warrior code. He was treating the Allied prisoners as enemies of Japan. And because these people had surrendered, particularly the ones that surrendered in Shanghai, the Japanese thought that surrendering was a fate worse than death. That's why the Japanese military would kill themselves when they knew they lost the battle. So they would treat him as subhuman. So he treated them that way because he was conditioned to treat them that way. So understanding and having empathy for the man is not the same as condoning. It's like, after all, when Jesus died for our sins, he wasn't condoning our sins. But he provided a way for us to have those sins removed from us, even though we were still enemies with God. So I would just encourage you, find a way. There are books you can read that help you go through the process of forgiving people. And I work with an alliance that combats human trafficking, and that's including children in the sex trades, and that there's no true healing for them until they can find it in their hearts to forgive their abusers. And so forgiveness is really important for having a fruitful life. So he comes back from Japan and he says, I need to give back to society as best I can. So he starts something called Victory Boys Camp. Of course, victory was a big word when you were in the World War II. That's why he named his angel Victor, short for victory. And so what he would do is he would take these kids out of these boys out of the California Youth Authority. They were locked up for the only reason they weren't in San Quentin was they were teenagers. And he would take them up in the high Sierras and he would teach them survival skills, teach them mountaineering skills, try to get to know them, get them to trust him, and then he'd share his story and the gospel with them. And he did this for many, many, many years. But when he finally passed away, the family decided we can't let this mission go, so we're going to keep going. And so I start going into the prisons, I start going to the high schools and talking to people. But then one day we discovered a teacher that was teaching the book Unbroken in her world geography class. I mean, people teach the book in English and history and now world geography. And the way she was teaching it was really having an impact on her students. And so we flew down to Texas to meet her, and we adopted her curriculum as the Louis Zamperini Foundation's Unbroken curriculum. We took Victory Boys camps and renamed it the Louis Zamperini Foundation. And I just want to share a little video with you about the effects that this story that I've just told you has on people when they're exposed to it.
Studying the book Unbroken, for me, was an incredible experience.
It's actually probably one of my favorite books now.
Before I had read the book, I felt like I was in a box.
I usually am not one for war stories, so when we started it, I was not expecting to enjoy it as much as I did. But as we got into it, it became less about war and more about being able to find yourself even in dark times and knowing that there is hope.
The Unbroken curriculum is about educating the whole student. It's important that academically, socially, emotionally, we make connections with students, we get them engaged in the classroom.
We read the complete novel, we watch the film, and then I turn it out to them. I have the students get in small groups and say, what do they think about this situation? How would they have struggled differently? Do they see themselves in that story?
All right, guys, now that we've talked about it within our rafts, let's talk about it as a class.
I think it really encouraged a lot of people to share their own stories, because once they read what Louis was going through, they finally felt like they had a place that they could share themselves.
When we did the assignment letters to Louis, where we talked about how the book impacted us, some of them were personal things that you would have never known about a person. And it kind of puts into perspective the whole idea of you don't know what someone's going through, so you just have to have the empathy and the respect for them and just imagine what they're going through.
I felt like I let the world off my shoulders because I finally got my story out there. People were judging me for being the bad kid, the kid that nobody wanted to be around. And when I read that story, everything changed.
Even though Louis has passed on, his story continues to teach us a lesson. He's always kind of there on your shoulder, like, see, never judge a book by its cover. I think that is the power that can change high schools.
Studying Unbroken has really pushed my limits and made me want to do more with my life.
It gave me the message to never give up. Even through the tough times, you just have to keep fighting through.
No matter the circumstances, you can come back from anything and be successful.
And I feel that's really what the Unbroken curriculum does, is it allows those students to feel that comfort level of this is my story, this is where I am, and this is what Louis went through, that was his journey. And because he went through that, I can go through my journey.
It takes your breath away. And it's so hard to find words to describe Unbroken and how Louis' story impacts us.
With this story told in this way in school districts across the country, it's having an effect on these kids that's going to last them their entire lives.
I was inspired to go and forgive all my enemies, to say, I forgive you for putting me in pain.
I could tell that all of us were impacted by it one way or another. And now I think we're all closer because of that.
We think when we want to engage kids that we need to, buy the next best thing, the next piece of technology that's going to reach kids. And we put a book in their hand and we let them talk.
When you combine the book with the roundtable discussions, they found themselves in the book, so it became much easier for them to talk to each other
Like, it's just kind of like an open environment. Like, you could say something and somebody might agree with this, somebody might disagree, but if they disagree about it, they will make a valid point.
Witnessing some of the discussions that they get to have about overcoming their own struggles in their life, having hope, they have an understanding that they are not alone, that they are not the only people who have struggles. Those are some pretty awesome lessons that they're learning.
They're developing a passion in the classroom. And this is a curriculum that has come into our school district. It's just caught on fire. We have teachers coming up and saying, what are you doing differently that I'm not doing? Because kids are excited about learning. So how can I take what you're doing and apply it to my subject, to English, to math, to social studies?
And I think it's a really cool way to learn world geography. It's not just learning from a textbook. You actually get to involve yourself in and put yourself in his shoes and follow his journey, and I think that's really cool.
Of course I'm going to go through things, and of course I'm going to have my battles, but I have this person to almost lean on to show me that I have somewhere I can go, and I know that if I keep my head up, it just might bring me to the other side.
What's amazing about studying the book Unbroken in public high schools, as well as other high schools, is that when you get to the chapter in the book where my dad comes to faith, which was the greatest miracle in his life, by the way, the book is being read aloud in the classroom. And in that chapter has the actual sermon that Reverend Graham preached that night in 1949. So you have the gospel being proclaimed in a public classroom. That's a mission that we can never give up. It's priceless. It's a secular book written by a secular author. The curriculum itself is secular, but the book contains the truth, and the truth is proclaimed in public high schools across this country. And that, as you can tell, it's helping the kids that are exposed to it. And with all the, you all are homeschool people, so you're exposed to the truth. In the public high schools, they're being fed a bunch of lies. And so the study of an American war hero that ends in the way it did is really good for this country. And we're hoping that if enough classes year after year are exposed to it, eventually we'll have a society of people that have heard the gospel and have been affected by it.